I got to tell you, I like walking out to that one right there. That's a good one. Makes you feel tough. Almost makes you feel like you're going to beat up on Indiana. So, hey, I'm Jeff Forster. I'm one of the pastors here, and we are in a message series. It's just 2 weeks long called Right on the Money, and it's everybody's favorite topic, especially at church, and so we know that. But before we jump into that, I love the songs that we sang today, right? We sang I'm Gonna See a Victory, one of my favorite songs we're doing right now. Our battle belongs to the Lord. There's power in the mighty name of Jesus. I'm not backing down from any giant because I know how this story ends. And I think, honestly, I genuinely believe this. I think some of you are here today because God knew you just needed to be reminded of that very idea. Let me ask you this, do you as a people, do you have confidence in God? Do you have confidence in the fact that God's going to provide for you? Yeah? Good. This has been part of the history of Heritage Church. Part of the character of the people of Heritage Church is believing that God is going to provide and then stepping out in faith and doing whatever it takes to continue to be a part of moving his kingdom forward. So this week we're celebrating Thanksgiving, which is like so much fun, thanking God for all of our many blessings. And it's one of those things that as we begin to wrestle through all of the cooking and bringing all the family members together, you get to have that amazing political conversation that you don't want to have. And maybe even if you're lucky, you get to talk about religion this weekend and all of the things that make family dinners so much fun when you get everybody together. And it can be kind of distracting from the main reason, and that is we're giving thanks for all of the incredible blessings that God has given us. We made it through another year. We may not have everything we want, but we have enough. And we're going to celebrate with bounty over the table and thank God for the fact that he has blessed us in so many extravagant, enormous ways. And so today, I want to talk to you with that in mind. I want to talk to you about the blessings of generosity, because at Heritage Church, we want to lead the way. We want to lead the way with irrational generosity. When it comes to finances, when it comes to anything in life, there's two parts to it. There's our part and there's God's part. There's our part. We have to do our part. Then God does his part. So if you would, grab your notes out of your program as you walked in the door today. You should have received a pen and some notes and things. I'll help you fill in a few blanks, and I'll help you. You can track along with some of the Bible verses. We'll put them up on the big screen here as well. So there's our part on life, and there's God's part when it comes to generosity, when it comes to finances, when it comes to relationships, when it comes to building a career. There's our part, and there's God's part if we're real followers of Jesus. So our part is we give generously. If you're filling in the blanks, we give generously. You could write plant above that. We plant generously, because what happens is we plant a seed and then God gives the increase. We give and then God expands that gift. I'm going to use a passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 9. This guy named Paul, he wrote most of the second half of the Bible, what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And he writes this. He says, "You must each decide in your heart how much to give. And don't give reluctantly or in response to pressure, for God loves a person who gives cheerfully." Have you ever heard that phrase, God loves a cheerful giver? That's where it comes from right here. And God will generously provide how much? He will generously provide what? All that you need, right? And then you will always have everything that you need and plenty left over to share with others. This is a big part of the whole concept behind Thanksgiving. Originally people who weren't fabulously wealthy, but they made it through a year and they're celebrating and they're sharing with the people around them in the bounties of God's blessing. So they had enough and they shared. And as the scriptures say, they share freely and give generously to the poor. Their good deeds will be remembered forever. So it turns out God says, I love it when my people are generous. And people love it when God's people are generous. It really is, as Jesus said, more blessed to give than to receive. So there's our part. We give generously, we plant generously, we share generously. And then God's part takes it way beyond, because we're just talking about addition here. I take some of mine and I give to you. So it's subtraction and addition. It leaves me and goes to you. So it's subtract one from me plus one to you. That's kind of the way that normal giving works. But when God steps in, it's totally different. God multiplies. He's not addition and subtraction. God's in multiplication mode. God multiplies abundantly. For God, he goes on, he keeps talking. He says, for God is the one who provides seed for the farmer and then bread to eat. In the same way, he'll provide and increase your resources and then produce a great harvest of generosity in you. Let me pause there for just a minute. It's God who provides the seed for the farmer. It's God who makes it possible for the farmer to have bread to eat. And I was thinking about this the other day. I was out hunting on a farm up in the Thumb, and we're surrounded by fields. There's corn fields and soybean fields and sugar beet fields all around in the Thumb, and these guys go out and they work so hard, and they have these great big machines, and in the springtime, they get out there and they plow the field, and they till the field, and they work the field, and they get the rocks out, and they get everything just right, and then they bring in these other big machines, and they begin to plant the seeds, and then they fertilize, they do all the work that they can do. And then in the fall now, what they're doing is they are, now they've got a bunch of combines and harvesters out there, and they're harvesting these massive fields of corn, these huge fields of soybeans. So they're doing tremendous amount of work. They're doing their part. The seed has to get in the ground. Somebody's got to take care of it. Somebody's got to make it work. But what a farmer cannot do, that only God can do, is a farmer cannot cause. A farmer is not at the cause of the germination of a seed. So you've got this dead, dried up seed, and you put it in the ground, and it germinates. It comes alive. It begins to create a plant, and that plant eventually grows up. I remember when I was a kid, we lived on the food that we grew, and so we would plant a seed, and we'd plant a corn kernel about this deep and then about that far apart, and we'd cover it over, and then we'd put plastic over it, keep it warm in the spring so that the ground would be just right, and then finally sun starts coming out, things warm up, and all of a sudden you start seeing these little shoots come up, a plant comes up, eventually it'll get about this tall, and there's 2 ears of corn, sometimes 3, usually just 2 ears of corn, and when I peel back the husks on the corn, there's hundreds and hundreds of kernels. I only put 1 kernel in the ground, and I get hundreds of kernels back. This is God multiplying, because God's the one who causes the seed to germinate. God's the one who provided the air and the warmth. God's the one who set the planet exactly the right distance from the sun so that we can have an atmosphere that can make it possible for us to grow food and to live. And you just go on and on and on and on and on. The farmer does his part. He plants the seed. He plows the ground. He does his part. But he just puts 1 seed in. And then God does his part, and we get hundreds of seeds back from that 1 seed. So God is the one who provides seeds for the farmer, and then obviously bread comes from seed. In the same way, he will provide and increase your resources and then produce a great harvest of generosity. God says, I'm going to give to you, and if you understand what I'm doing, if you understand the power of multiplication, God says, I'm going to multiply that in you and through you. We'll talk about this a little bit next week. And he said, I'm going to increase your resources. And as I increase your resources, you want to increase in resources? Yes. God says, then it's going to produce a great harvest of generosity in you. Yes, you will be enriched in what ways? Every way. You'll be enriched. When you develop a life of generosity, you will be enriched in your relationships. You'll be enriched in your career. You'll be enriched in every way so that you can always be generous. And when we take your gifts to those who need them, they'll thank God. So I felt like this message was extremely relevant, very timely, because this weekend, is the weekend before we celebrate Thanksgiving. And it's pretty amazing to me. The studies show, I just read a thing recently in Wall Street Journal that talks about the fact that most Americans don't feel rich, which I think is funny. We are the richest, 300 and some odd million of us, the richest, largest group of wealthy people in the history of humanity, but we don't feel rich all the time. And then studies are out there that say, it's interesting, we don't feel rich, but most Americans feel like we're generous. We think that we're generous, which is funny, because the average American gives about 2.8% of our money we give in charity, about 2.8%. And by the way, before you get too excited about that, if your household makes between 100 and 200,000, you actually give about 2.6%. So you give less money as you start making more money is usually how we go with that. We give about 2.8, 2.6%. And the reason is we live with a scarcity mindset. So while on one day we're celebrating Thanksgiving, thanking God for what he provided for us, the way we actually live our life is not that God provides. We live our life that we provide. And when we believe that we're the providers, we begin to live with a scarcity mindset. And the mindset that we have this Thanksgiving tells very clearly who it is we think that provides for us. So on one side, there's a scarcity mindset. On the other side, there's an abundance mindset. Scarcity and abundance go in cycles. So scarcity cycles into more scarcity, cycles into more scarcity, cycles into more scarcity. Abundance cycles into more abundance, into more abundance. And here's what we're talking about. The scarcity cycle is this. Who provides? God provides. That's right. God's the one who provides. But if I'm living in a scarcity mindset, I think I provide. And if I'm the provider, that I'm the one that's out there scratching out a living and I'm the one who's figuring out how to provide, then I understand that there are limited resources available to me. And so then we consume. First thing we do, I provide, and those provisions are for consumption. That's my purpose behind providing, is to consume. We need to eat. We need a house. We need a car. We need to keep the cell phones on. We got to keep the internet on. Everybody needs Disney Plus. So we had to do all the things that are so important because The Mandalorian's cool. And we have to do all this stuff. And I got to provide. So I provide, and then I consume what I provide. And then what happens is, if you're the normal American, so I know you're not. You're the exception. But the normal American is spending more money every year than they bring in every year. We're going into debt for all the things that we have. We spend more money. So what happens is we consume and then we overconsume. So then we start to lack. We don't have enough. We're afraid because there's limited resources available. We live in fear. And then what do? We keep providing for ourselves. And so we consume and we lack and we fear. And we consume and we lack and we fear. And we consume and we lack, fear. And it's just this crazy cycle that we're on. And if you're wondering if you're a person who lives by scarcity, what I know is in the previous services, the people who are living in abundance come and say, Pastor Jeff, that was a great message. I loved it. And all the rest tried not to make eye contact on the way out the door. When you heard we were talking about money today, you went, ugh, right? It's because you're living a life of scarcity. But the abundance cycle is the other way. The abundance cycle is recognizing that God provides. There's no limit to the provision of God. And so our first response is not consumption. We have to consume. But our first response is we give. And when we give, we see God multiply. There's plenty for you, he says, and plenty for others. And so we see God multiply. When we see God multiply, this grows our faith. We have confidence that God's going to provide for us again. And so we continue to give. And when we give, God multiplies. God multiplies. Our faith grows. Our faith grows. We give. We give. God multiplies. Our faith grows. And we give. And it goes into that cycle. So there's two mindsets. Scarcity, which says there's not enough. And abundance, which says there's more than enough in God's house. So the real question at Thanksgiving that you have to wrestle with, even among all the other crazy things that's going to be going on, is ask yourself, who are you depending on? Are you depending on yourself, or are you depending on your Father? My daughter, Jenna, when she was little, she's just cute as a bug. She's like this tall, blonde hair, cute little pigtails. My sons were in middle school when she was beginning to learn language. So she was cute as a bug, but the words that came out of her mouth sometimes would shock us because her language and her sense of humor was like middle school boy humor. So it was shocking to you. And she just had so much fire in her all the time. She's always been in charge, right? In her mind anyways. And so when she was little, we would have daddy-daughter days, and we'd go on these little dates together. And she'd wear a cute little dress and cute little shoes and cute little socks. And we'd go, hey, where do you want to go today, Jenna? And she says, I want to go to Arby's and get some curly fries. And hey, you don't have to say curly fries to me twice. So we went to Arby's. And we get to Arby's, and she orders a kid's meal, and I order a dad-size meal. And so I get a big sandwich, and she gets a little sandwich, and I get a big bunch of curly fries, and she gets like this much curly fries. So we go outside, and they had some picnic tables outside. We go out and we sit down, and I got a tray, put some ketchup, and then I just poured both. Her little bit of fries, my big fries, we poured all in there together. And she starts talking, and little girls, especially that little girl, can talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. Dora the Explorer this, and it was just talk. And so, believe it or not, I'm most of the way through my sandwich, my dad-sized sandwich. And finally, I reach out and I go to take a fry. pow. She smacks me and she said, what are you doing? I said, I thought we'd share some fries. And she grabs the tray, pulls it to her side of the table and goes, these ones are mine. There's a mountain. There's a mountain of fries as big as her head on this plate. And she pulls it to my side. So then she goes back, talk. And I reach out for another fry. Bam, right in the middle of a sentence. Pow! And she looked at me, she said, I said these are mine. Here's a little girl that's like 35 pounds. I'm 200 and none of your business pounds. And the fact that she smacked my hand, looked me right in the eye and said, these are my fries. I thought it was funny, you know. So I negotiate for a fry or two. She begrudgingly allows me to have a couple fries. And on the way home, I'm thinking, this is funny. God really used my daughter to teach me a great lesson. Because I'm going to go home and tell my wife about how funny this was. And then God begins to just kind of lean into me on this, right? Jenna, in her immaturity at this point, she has this fear of not having enough. She has a lack of confidence in knowing that her father has way more than she needed. And God began to say, isn't that how you act with me a lot of times? In your immaturity, you think you've got to protect what is yours. And you didn't even pay for it, really. In her immaturity, she thought if she let me have some of the fries, which, by the way, I provided. Legally, they were mine. I had the receipt, and it was my money that paid for it. I provided them, but she thought if she let me have some of the fries that I provided, she might not have enough, which is funny because there were more fries that can actually fit in that little tiny belly of hers. But she was afraid if she loaned it to me or let me have it, that she wouldn't have enough. She didn't realize the reality is I could have taken my American Express and bought a dump truck load of French fries and dumped curly fries out. I could have buried her in curly fries if I wanted to. And she overestimated the joy that a whole tray of curly fries would bring her, even though she couldn't finish them all herself. And she underestimated the love of her father and the extraordinary riches relative to her. I mean, she's broke. She don't have nothing. So relative to her, the extraordinary riches that her father could provide for her, which was far more than just a few fries. And I began to realize, God, I live my life that way all the time. Smack his hand, keep your hand off it, it's mine, when in reality, he's the one who provided all of it. If you view your life through the lens of scarcity, you will always be fearful. You will always be anxious. But Jesus has a much different plan for you because everything that God has is excessive. Everything that God does is extravagant, far more than enough. And God tells us the secret. And this is the breakthrough for me. Not just coming out of that story, but that was a reinforcement to this life-changing understanding that I've had in my own personal life. And maybe I haven't communicated it well enough to you. That the mechanism that God has put in place to unlock the extravagant blessings of the Father in our practical lives is the tithe. So I want to talk about that. The power of the tithe. Because tithing breaks the cycle of scarcity and it creates, even generates a new cycle of supply. So let me read this. Maybe the most famous passage is in Malachi chapter 3. Now, we see tithing before the law. We see Jesus affirming the tithe after the law. But here you go. Malachi says this. You people, this is what God says, by the way. This is God speaking in the book of Malachi. He says, you people are robbing me, your God. Now, I took Hebrew in college, and I passed it. I'm certainly not a Hebrew expert, but I passed Hebrew, and I'm good enough that I can look up a Hebrew dictionary, know what it means. And the word that he uses here to say rob, we see rob in English, and we go, okay, he's pickpocketing God. The word that God uses is maybe the most violent version of rob. He's literally saying, you've carjacked me, put a gun to my head, wrenched my arm behind my back, and stole everything violently. It's a felonious assault kind of rob. And the people in Israel would have understood that God chose to use a felonious assault kind of word when he's talking here. He says, so you've roughed me up and taken what is not yours from your God, he says. And here you are, you're asking, how are we robbing you? And God says, you're robbing me of the offerings and of the what? 10% that belongs to me. That's why your whole nation is under a curse. Listen, We live under a curse. This world is broken. All humans, apart from God's supernatural intervention, we live in a broken world that is cursed. A world where death is normal, where destruction is normal, where degradation is normal, where things rust and where things rot. Everything is going down unless God steps in and supernaturally intervenes, which is what we want. When we're singing, I'm going to see a victory, we're saying, God, I need to see you step in and do something supernatural in my life. And for many of you, that's a financial thing. And God says, listen, when you're robbing me, you're sticking a gun to my head and taking what's mine. God says, no wonder you're living like everybody else lives. No wonder you're so stressed out like everybody else is stressed out. You're living under the same curse everybody else is living under. So let me talk to you about the mechanism that unlocks that supernatural intervention when it comes to these things. God says, I am the Lord all-powerful. Do you see where he says that? I am the Lord all-powerful, and I challenge you. Again, I've already admitted, I'm not a Hebrew expert, but I'm pretty sure in Hebrew it means double dog dare you. He says, I challenge you to put me to the test. It's the only time in the Bible God challenges you to test him. And he says, bring the entire 10% to the storehouse, God's house, so there will be food in my house. It's not because God's looking to raid the refrigerator. God's saying so that there's plenty for everybody. And he says, and then I'll open the windows of heaven. Then is a very important word. Anytime you see a big connector word like that, pay attention to what's before, because what comes after is going to be a really good benefit if you qualify on the front end. So he says, bring the whole 10% in. And then he says, then I'll open the windows of heaven and flood you with blessing after blessing, favor after favor, joy after joy, happiness after happiness. God says the favor of God will be poured out upon you over and over and over again. He said, bring the entire 10%. Now, this is important to remember. He does not say, there's never a time in the Bible God says, give the tithe. He doesn't command us to give it. He commands us to bring it. If you own something, I can't give you what you already own. It's not possible. I can only bring you what you own. God, here's the big deal. When we walk into church and we think we're bringing our $25 to God this week, we're not. We're not bringing our tithe to God. We're not giving our tithe to God, rather. We're bringing it to him because he already owns it. Quite honestly, the difference between giving and bringing is all about ownership. So when we return the tithe to God, it releases God's blessing. God's saying there's more than you can imagine. It's held in reserve in heaven like a massive lake behind a dam. And it's not that God is stingy. He's not saying he's only going to do this when you pay up. He's not broke. He doesn't need the cash. What he's saying is that he can know with certainty that he can trust you with the abundance of heaven when you put your faith into action by bringing back the first 10%. It shows that he has first place in our hearts. A couple months ago, I mentioned in passing, inadvertently in a message, that the previous 18 months had been maybe the hardest 18 months in my 30 years of ministry. And I mentioned that only after, and it was an inadvertent statement, but it was after, talking with my mentors and my counselors and getting some counsel and things. And I was in a pretty good place at that point. But when I mentioned it, lots of people went, oh, Pastor Jeff's having a hard time. And they would come and encourage me and tell me that they're praying for me. And people would ask, how can I help you? And what can I do? And I wasn't ever sure, but I do know this. I'm not worthy to be your pastor. The kind of love and the kind of care that you show me is incredible. And so it was very humbling that so many people would come and ask. And I didn't really know what to say at the time. But in talking with my counselors and my friends and my mentors, I came down to this. There are several reasons maybe that was a hard time. But perhaps the main reason, and I didn't realize it at the time, but maybe the main reason I was struggling was because I'm a person of vision. I've always been able to see the future and pull together a team and chart out a course and roll up our sleeves and do the hard work to achieve the mission that God has given us in life. And my problem, I think, was this, that the vision I believe that God had given me for Heritage Church far exceeded the resources that we had at our disposal. We could be doing so much more for the families in our community, and so much more for the homeless, and so much more for the single parents, and for those that are in recovery. We could be doing so much more for kids and after-school programs, and for the refugees in our community. We could be planting more churches here and there and everywhere. We could be having a greater impact on a global level through online church and all these things. But the frustration was very heavy for me during that time, and I couldn't always articulate it because God's vision that he was giving us was so huge. But our giving was just enough to keep the lights on and keep the music going and the coffee flowing for free out in the lobby. We're not in trouble financially. We'll be fine again next week. We will. But we're bringing in just enough to keep the lights on and to pay our bills. We give away, as a church, we give away about 10% of what comes in. We spend outside of Heritage Church doing good things, and then the rest we pretty much live on, and it's just enough. And so here's the thing, because this was a real struggle for me. It was a very, very heavy burden for me for a while. And what I discovered through good counsel was something I'm ashamed of. I'm not proud of it. And what my friend told me, he says, you know what? You want to blame church people. I was like, yes. And I justified it. I said, well, here's why, and stick with me on this because I'm not blaming you, but here's how I justified it with him. I said the average household income of the people at Heritage Church is equal to the average household income of the community around us, which for a two-worker family is $100,000 plus a year is the average for our area, which is nearly 60% more than the median income of the average household in America. And we live in Macomb County, which has a relative lower cost of living than most upper middle class communities in America. And yet, and this was where I blamed you, yet Heritage Church gives 50% less per person than an average church of 2,000 in America. So we make 60% more and we give 50% less than the average church of 2,000 people in America. Gotcha. And I didn't realize what a negative thing that was having on me. So I found myself blaming you for the fact that our vision far exceeded our income. But then my jerk of a friend, and you know who you are, said, hey, last I heard, everything rises and falls on leadership. And I said, you're a jerk. And I said, well, I feel like I've led well in this. My wife and I, we've been crazy generous as we come through the Daring Faith thing, which finishes up at the end of December. Total, over the last 3 years, my wife and I have given $125,000. And let me tell you, we don't have that kind of money. And yet God keeps showing up. Just last week, we were having a hard conversation, making a hard decision about some deferred maintenance on our house that we needed to do. And we were really tempted to go into debt to do it because it needs to be done. And we were frustrated. But then just in my heart, we can't go into debt to get this thing fixed. It's crazy. And then literally out of the blue, so I'm like, God, you got to show up because you said, test me. And we've gone way beyond a test, and you've got to show up on this. And I'm complaining with a little bit of a bad attitude. I'm not a very good Christian. And that day, I promise you, I'm not exaggerating, that day, somebody called me and hired me to do a project that pays me more money than is necessary to get that little project done. Let me tell you, we can't give the kind of money we've given and live the life that God's allowing us to live. It's not possible unless God multiplies what we give. There's no other way. It's a miracle. So my wife and I, we live this miracle every day, and it's not always sunshine and roses and unicorns and Skittles everywhere all the time. It's not. It's hard, but God blesses us. And this is what my friend said, is you're living out the blessing of God all the time, but you have not yet led your people to value those same things. You've not yet led your people to put God first in their tithes and in their offerings. So you've been an example in your own life. You're experiencing the benefits, but no wonder your people are broke, and no wonder your people are struggling to see God's blessing in their lives. No wonder people feel like they're constantly spinning their wheels. You know the answer, but you're not making a big deal about it, and it's because you're afraid of people. And it's true. I didn't want to offend anybody. When we get up, and Wesley said it a little while ago, if you're a guest with us today, what do you say? If you're a guest with us today, if you can finish that sentence, you're not a guest today, just so you know. But we didn't want to offend anybody. We know that's the number one reason why people get grumpy when they go to church. All I ever want to do is get my money and stuff. So for real, that's a real issue for us. We're not trying to get your money, but I think maybe I stayed mostly silent on the benefits because I didn't want to offend anybody on the front end. But here's what I know. Most sane people do what they believe will benefit them. Most sane people will do what they believe will benefit them. So if you're not living a super generous life of abundance, it's because you are not yet convinced of its benefits. So that's partly on me. So I want to spend a little bit of time, just a tiny bit of time, so I'm going to give you 3 points, pop, 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 just like that, setting this straight. So let me be clear. What am I being? I'm being very clear. Very good. Tithing is not about what the church can get from you. It's not that God's broke. Tithing has 3 huge biblical benefits that have massive implications in your own life. The first one, if you're filling in the blanks, and like I said, we're going to go through these quickly, tithing teaches us to put God first. Tithing teaches us to put God first. Just because you have in the header on your Twitter feed or on your social media, God first, family second, everything else third. The Bible says, you know how I know that tithing teaches us to put God first? Look what Deuteronomy chapter 14 says. The purpose of tithing is to teach you to always put God first in your lives. Do you know how I know that tithing teaches me to put God first? Because he says tithing teaches you to always put God first. It's not something I made up, it's what God says. And by the way, Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. It's really an obedience issue. Either I obey or I don't. There's no such thing as just partial obedience. So you say, wow, Jeff, if I'm going to put God first in my finances like this, and I'm going to give God the first 10%, for me to do that, I'd have to rearrange my whole life. Yes. I'd have to give something up. Yes. This would stretch my faith. Yes. Which leads us to the next point. Tithing builds our faith. You see how creative we are in putting our messages together? Isn't that amazing? Tithing builds our faith. He says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, bring it into God's house, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this. It's the only place where God says, test him, try him, challenge him. Says the Lord Almighty, and see. This is a faith thing. And see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will be not enough room to store it. God says, give me your first and give me your best, and I'll bless the rest. But I'll tell you this, in my own life, I know it's true. It takes real faith to give the first 10%, and it doesn't take any faith to give the last. It doesn't. So it's the first. And so maybe, and this was a kind of a way that maybe you could get started, and I know many people have done this, say, all right, I'm going to take God on for 90 days. I'm going to do a 90-day tithe challenge. And you can test God's faithfulness by returning the first 10% to him. And countless people experience his blessings when they tithe, but the first step sometimes can be the hardest step. So maybe you just say, all right, God, I'm going to do it for 90 days. And I'm going to prove whether or not you exist and whether or not you're going to be faithful and whether or not you're actually going to provide. Because I personally, Jeff Forster, does not have to prove this to you. It's all on God. I didn't write that passage. God did. And God challenged you. He double dog dared you. He was the one that said put him to the test. But you'll only know if he's real. You'll only know if he's true. You'll only know if he really does do what he says he's going to do if you actually try it for real when you go all in. By the way, Pastor Kevin says, I'd rather live on 90% of my income with 100% of God's blessing than live on 100% of my income with 0% of God's blessing. And I have to ask you, which is harder? Living on 100% with no blessing, it's just as hard as everybody else. Or is it living on 90% with all of God's blessing? That's the supernatural intervention when it comes to it. You go, I can't afford it, and I'll never be able to. And I would agree with you. That's true. You can't afford it, and you'll never be able to. Until you do. So a while ago, I read this article. Last year, I read this article about this guy who said if you used his system, anybody, any body shape could get to the point where they could do 100 push-ups. So this body shape, I wasn't sure was made for 100 push-ups. But I thought, well, that's kind of a cool challenge, and I was looking for something to do. So I decided I'm going to implement his process. So I get down there, I start doing it. And so my first day, I did 8 or 9 push-ups, which is a lot. When you're pushing this up, that's a lot. But I begin the process. So first day or two, I do like 8 or 9, and then a few days later, it goes up to 11, and then we go up to like 13, and then up to 15. It keeps going that way over a few months. I get up, finally I'm doing like 77 push-ups at a pop. 77. I can't do 77 push-ups, which is true until I could. There was incremental, intentional, incremental increases to get me to the point where I could do what was claimed. So you're right, I couldn't. because I didn't have any muscle. But then I could because I did. You see what I'm saying? So at a point, it might just be about you stepping up and going, okay, what's my percentage? Because God's not asking for an amount. He's asking for a percentage, 10%. So what is my current percentage? And if you're normal, it's 2.6, 2.8%. And you go, okay, there's no way I could get to 10%, so what do? God, between now and Christmas, I'm going to bump it up to 6%. That's not full obedience yet, but you're moving in that direction. You start doing those push-ups. You start getting a little stronger. And then, God, I'm going to bump it up to 8%. And then, God, I'm going to get it to 10%. It's about being intentional about the next step. And I know you'll never get to the full blessings of God until you begin going in that direction. So it's biblical to give. And biblical giving is regular. You plan it. It's the first, not the leftovers. It's percentage-based, not numbers-based. And it always requires faith. As a matter of fact, faith is the confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see, because what does he say? What does he say? Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Number 3, if you're filling in the blanks, and this is the last point, tithing provides for the work of God. This is God's plan. This is why he says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. So the whole tithe is the mechanism to release the supernatural blessings of God and reverse the curse. But he says that there may be food in my house. Again, like I mentioned, he's not trying to raid the fridge. He's trying to make sure that everything is provided for in everyone. So here's 4 simple truths from Malachi. Stealing from God has significant consequences. Living under the curse. 2, God blesses us when we bring the whole tithe. And then our blessing, when the people of God are blessed, the church of God is blessed, when God's people are blessed. And it's not just about us. It's not just so we can have bigger and nicer things. We've got enough now. Let's be honest. It's pretty extraordinary what God has given us at Heritage Church. We have enough. But the world is blessed when God's churches are blessed. Our neighborhoods, our communities, our county, our region, our state, our nation, the world is blessed when God's churches are blessed. And so God just says this, try it. Put me to the test. Look what he says. Your crops will be abundant, for I'll guard them from insects and disease. Your grapes will not fall from the vine before they're ripe, says the Lord of heaven's armies. Is that not one of the coolest names of God? God wants you to think of him as the Lord of heaven's armies. He's the king of the armies of heaven. Circle that, underline that. And he says, when this happens, all the nations will call you blessed. I want to point out a couple things. He says, when you put me to the test, I'm going to open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing on you. But he also says, your crops will be abundant. Crops are essential. You need crops for bread. You have to have crops in order to be alive. He says, I'll bless the essentials. As a matter of fact, I'll personally guard them as the Lord of heaven's armies. But then he also says, and your grapes will not fall. Grapes are not essential. Grapes make wine, and wine is just to make life better. So he's saying your crops will be abundant. The essentials I'm going to take care of. I'm going to provide a better life for you, and the Lord of heaven's armies is going to guard it. So the question is, who's guarding your stuff? If it's yours, you got to guard it. If it's God's, he has to guard it. No wonder we stay frustrated. We're trying to manage something that's not ours. We're trying to hang on to something that's not ours, and we stay frustrated. We start fighting God all the time. We're not willing to surrender, because tithing is an issue of obedience, and obedience is always a surrender issue. But instead of surrendering this one big, massive issue in our life, we keep fighting God. We're battling God. So let me ask you, isn't it time to surrender? Isn't it time to tell God, I surrender all?
Surrender, not to him I freely give. I will ever love and trust him in his presence daily live. And I surround.